Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today, I have the honors of interviewing a special scholar, Professor Claudia Yaghoobi, Roshan Distinguished Professor of Persian Studies, and the Director of the Center for Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. We are going to be speaking about Attar, the famous Persian poet. Professor Yaghoobi has published a book called Subjectivity in Attar, Persian Sufism and European Mysticism. Let's first welcome her, and then I will be asking her some questions. Hello, Professor. Thank you very much for accepting this interview. I'm truly honored.
Hi, Dr. Rahbari, and hi, everyone. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for accepting this interview. Professor, can you please tell us a little bit about yourself, like your educational background, your research focus?
Absolutely. So let me tell your audience a little bit about my background in Iran also, because I've been in the US for 20 years, 19 years now. And back in Iran, I actually was a faculty member in Azad University in the Rudahan branch teaching English literature. And I had a master's degree in English, and I was teaching English literature. I was also teaching ESL in Kish language school, and the one that was in Vanak. So in 2006, my family decided, because all my relatives were in the US, so we decided to leave Iran, and I'm of Armenian heritage, so we decided to leave Iran, and we did travel and come to, Los Angeles. But before leaving, my very good professor from back in the time I was doing my master's in English literature was Dr. Jalal Sokhanvar, who many of you might know. He used to teach in Azad University of the North Branch, Tehran Shomal. I met with him, and I told him that I was leaving, and I asked him, what would you suggest I pursue as a research topic? Because I've done English literature, now I'm going there, and what would you think would be a good topic or research project to focus on? And his suggestion was to work on something comparative and work on Sufism. And of course, like everyone else in Iran, we grow up learning about Hafez, Attar, Maulana, and reading them at school and everywhere, also in our houses. But I never thought of, doing this comparative literature kind of thing. So I came to the US in 2006. I applied for different schools. And I did have to do my master's degree again. And first I did it just in English again. And then that was a kind of, stepping stone for me for the next step, which was the PhD, which I actually got into comparative literature with, the project that became my dissertation and the book. That was Attar and European mysticism and comparing them. And that ended up being my first book, which you just read the title, Subjectivity in Attar. And then after that, as I was working on Attar, I also started, taking different classes in gender and sexuality studies, and I got very interested in women's rights and activism in Iran. So my second book became a topic on women and sighe marriages and temporary marriages and how it has been represented in literature and film in Iran, in the cultural productions. And then my third book, I focused on my Armenian heritage. So I did Iranian Armenian cultural productions. And my fourth book, which is currently under review, is on Iranian Armenian women. So a little bit from Attar and Sufism to women, but the general thread that you will see is looking at the underdog, to put it in a very spoken language, kind of colloquial.
Very interesting background and research topics. Thank you very much for sharing. Professor, the first question is this. What drew you initially towards Attar? And what do you think makes him distinguished from other mega Sufi poets like Rumi, like Hafez?
So, I've always been fascinated by, again, as I said, the underdog, or the one who's not as popular or as famous. And I've always been drawn to, the topics, the concepts of crossing boundaries, breaking the law, the transgression. And by this, I don't mean like actual breaking the law. The law can be the law that we have in our minds that limits us, like the framework, our mental framework that is limiting us. And in Iran, we have so much of that. There's societal, policing, there's cultural policing, and we are constantly limiting ourselves. And we have this mental framework that puts us in this, box. So what does it mean to get out of this box? That was a topic that even when I was in Iran, back in my, English literature times, I was fascinated by that topic. And I was curious about the people who push against societal norms and how I wanted to see how these people are seen, not just today that we are living, but, the modern times, but historically, like in Attar's times, how would these kinds of people would have been viewed? So that curiosity, plus, Dr. Sohambar's suggestion that I should do something comparative and look at irfan, was the word that we used in Iran. I was like, okay, maybe, Attar is not that famous, but Attar in Iran was very famous. Like Mantiqater was the one book that everybody knew, and I loved it, that book. We read it in high school. So why not, focusing on Attar? That was the initial, attraction towards Attar. I didn't want to duplicate what had been done about Hafez and Rumi, which there's so much work out there that has been done about them. What makes Attar stand out is, unlike other Sufi poets who withdrew from the world, most of them were, Gushe Neshin, and Attar actually engages in the society, from what I read in his poetry. And what I talk about today, everyone, is my own interpretation. This is not like, something that is like a verse of Bible or Quran. To me, Attar writes poetry that champions the outcasts and the misfits. And by outcasts and misfits, what I mean is, for example, we read stories about people who are stealing, people who are drunkards, people who are crossing all sorts of, moral, ethical, religious, societal, cultural lines and boundaries. But he writes about these people, and these people become the models for the reader who are on a spiritual path. And then he questions the norms of his time through, allegory and deep compassion, which is like storytelling about these, underdogs, the misfits, telling us that these people are on a spiritual journey. And he shows us their transformation and how they get to a union with the divine. So doing this, he's blurring the lines between sacred and profane, which are the words that we use in the US, or in scholarship in the US, for, people who are sacred are the religious figures, and you would think they should be our role models for spirituality. But then for our role models, Attar gives us, the person who's drinking in Khanaqah. So it's just like, kind of breaking what's already in our mind and that framework, that box, that we think it should be this, but then Attar gives us a totally different perspective. And then he also blurs the lines between the self and the other. And the self and the other is like the nafs, me, my ego, my everything. And then there is this other that comes in and teaches me how to, walk on the spiritual path. So these are the things that I think make him distinct and from other poets. And if I were to wrap up, let's say if Hafez seduces us with beauty in his poetry, and then Rumi gives us this ecstasy and uplifts us, Attar confronts us. He strips away the ego, he strips away the nafs and the illusion and gives us the naked truth. What I mean is, when Attar writes, to me, he is not trying to comfort anyone. He is not trying to give us any, aesthetic poetry or lyrical poetry, even though he's doing all of those too. But the main thing he's doing is he's trying to awaken us. Because as a reader, for me at least that happened, when I'm reading Attar's poetry, I go on this spiritual journey with, let's say, the birds of Attar, the conference of the birds, or if we look at smaller stories in Attar, let's say Sheikh San'an. If we go read one story, one allegory, smaller parable, you go on a journey with Sheikh San'an. And Sheikh San'an is actually a very good example of what I was talking about. All the taboos and all the mental frameworks that we have, he breaks all of them. I just thought that, the best example of what I'm talking about is the story of Sheikh San'an in the Conference of the Birds in Attar. Because for those who don't know the story of Sheikh San'an is this very devout Muslim peer who sees this Christian girl in his dream and falls in love kind of with this Christian girl and travels to meet her. And he travels to this region, which is a very predominantly Christian region. And then the girl puts forward all these taboo demands from Sheikh San'an. She asks him to abandon his religious practice, to burn the Quran, to drink wine, to, herd the swine. And he does all of them. He does all these steps, and his students start, kind of condemning or questioning and, critiquing him. But what Attar is doing is that by showing that the Sheikh is going through all this process of doing all these deeply transgressive acts, he's actually having a deep spiritual transformation. That is, the Sheikh, quote unquote, who's falling is not actually falling, is having a spiritual transcendence. And the whole story is about moving away from these rigid boundaries, rigid definitions of what a religious practice or a religious figure should be doing or should be presenting, and having openness and accepting like fluid definitions of everything. So this idea of crossing boundaries that I was talking about, even if it's our mental framework, is clearly, crystallized in Sheikh of San'an. And I have done all this, analysis of Sheikh San'an and comparing him to some counterparts from European mysticism in my book.
A very important point you mentioned is social mysticism. There are some Sufis who radically detach from the world, some even like quitting the societal life completely. And there are other mystics, other Sufis like Rumi, who is a social mystic, although he has this like moderate detachment and asceticism, but he is a social person. Just look at his works, look at the gatherings in which he was composing the poetry. He wasn't sitting in a corner in a cave writing those poems. He is in gatherings. There is music. Some people are performing sama dance, and he is composing those poems. Sometimes just saying that, and his pupils writing. We also see the same kind of social mysticism in the 17th century mystic poet, philosopher Feyz Kashani, Mullah Mohsen Feyz Kashani, who was also a social mystic. My question is, what makes this important today in our lives? There is monasticism on the one side and social mysticism on the other. Why is it important today?
I mean, it's very important because we are living in a world that even if we want to compare the same with, today's world in terms of the rulers of today, the government, if they are just living in their own small world, not engaging with the society and not knowing that what's happening to the working class, for example, it's going to be, they are going to have a huge backlash. So if you want to see true like transformation and true like spirituality, you have to be in the middle of the society. You have to follow someone who knows all these people, not just sitting somewhere. Because I can tell you about Ramadan, for example. In Ramadan, I know a lot of my Muslim friends fast. There is fasting. And in the US, I see people, always kind of isolate themselves because they don't want to be exposed to, the temptation of, okay, I'm fasting, and if I, go to a party or something, I will be tempted. But then I remember in Iran during Ramadan, we were working, we were going everywhere, we were doing everything. Some people would eat, some people were not eating, and they were fasting. And from childhood, I remember learning from all the, from media, TV, from my friends, telling me that the entire sawab is in the fact that you fast and not be tempted, be in front of the temptation and not be tempted. So that can be an example, like analogy for this. If you want to have spirituality and you sit at home and pray and do all these things, there is no temptation. So your spirituality is not going to be, to me at least, it's not that valuable because you're not in the middle of the society tempted with all these things, and you're not going through the trials that you should really go through and cross. And that's, again, another example is the Conference of the Birds, and the birds who go through all these trials to get where they see that the divine is within themselves rather than out there. So the divine is within each one of us, and if you are amongst people out there socializing with people but also practicing your spirituality, and then like able to avoid temptations, that's actual, transformation. That's actual spiritual transcendence rather than isolating yourself. But in addition to those, who were withdrawing from, if I'm not wrong, who were writing for the kings, for the rulers, right? They were courtly poets. And Attar was not even that either. So there's all these different types of poets that we had. And he wasn't willing to praise the kings and, the rulers. He was actually critiquing them. So there is that too. Sorry, not Sadi, Sanoi.
That Ramazan example was actually very, very sharp. And the idea of spirituality without challenge, you're right, it's just a joke. But coming to court flattery poetry, I share the same frustration. Before I was focusing on the 7th, 8th century Hijri poetry. And but recently I have turned my research focus more towards Hafez Kashani's period, that is the Safavid era, 17th century CE, where this court poetry flattering the kings changes, like the qaside form of poetry, which was originally not originally about the poem, but the poetic form's capacity allows for praise, and this was mainly used in courts, and I always had problems with this. But in Safavid period, that changes. Mystics like Faiz Kashani, like Muhtasham Kashani, start talking about theomystical and philosophical topics mostly through qasida form. Although ghazal is also the primary poetic form, but the qasida form changes, diverges from that flattery form, and finds greater depth. Composing poetry to get financial benefits from kings. And I'm happy that this happened. So I too share your frustration. Thank you for pointing that out. Professor, the second question is, how do you distinguish love, that is ishq in Farsi, and knowledge, that is Maʿrifa in Arabic, and Maʿrifat in Farsi, in Attar's poetic universe?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think the example of Sheikh Sanan, right? Because for Attar, love or ishq isn't just an emotion. It's a very powerful destabilizing force that leads the Sufi wayfarer or the seeker to true knowledge, which is Maʿrifat. So the example is Sheikh Sanan is a peer. He has been a peer, this Muslim peer for 50 years. He has so many disciples and students, but what he has is the intellectual understanding of the divine. He has not lived it. And the intellectual understanding is not enough. To Attar, it is through surrender, through this passionate, destabilizing love that you are able to, and this love is painful because Sheikh Sanan goes through so much pain. I mean, he humbles himself in front of this young Christian girl, so much so that he sleeps in front of her door until she accepts and puts forward some of these demands, and he goes and does them. So he actually leaves all these trials to be able to bring together love and knowledge, which is ishq and Maʿrifat. So in Attar's works, ishq and Maʿrifat are not only, coexisting, but also they are interdependent, they are intertwined, they rely on one another. So and again, the same is true for all the birds that we see. The conference of the birds, I give examples of the conference of the birds a lot, but the conference of the birds is the bigger story. Sheikh Sanan is this small story within the conference of the birds, the Mantiqate. So anyway, yeah, it's forbidden love, this painful love, this passionate love that allows Sheikh Sanan to surrender, to confront with his own nafs, to confront with it, to break the nafs, because he breaks the nafs, humbling himself, he breaks the nafs, and he comes to this breakthrough, which is, the unraveling of the knowledge, the divine knowledge, Maʿrifat.
So, do you agree that in Persian poetry, for many of the poets, love, mystic love, is actually a pathway leading to Maʿrifa, leading to knowledge, transcending just the emotion?
Absolutely. And I would say that without that love, there's no Maʿrifat, because it's these two have to be together. Basically, in this type of mysticism, which I see in Attar's, is love mysticism, kind of. Loving the creatures that have been created by the divine is the path towards that Maʿrifat. They are the manifestations of the divine. So the doorway to that Maʿrifat is loving these creations. And loving these creations comes with all sorts of trials and tribulations. It is very painful, and it is also very passionate. So, and transgressive and forbidden. And, another example is Layli and Majnun. Which, we also see a variation of this story in Attar's works, as well as we see in other poets too, Nizamis, Rumis, everyone has, even Jami has some. I mean, love is so important for me that I have a tattoo of ishq on my...
Wow. In Farsi, I suppose, right?
Yeah,
Amazing.
it's ishq.
Yeah.
It says ishq.
Amazing.
Professor, the third question is, how has Attar's legacy been received and reinterpreted in the contemporary Iranian culture? And the same question about that reception and reinterpretation from the West.
Yeah, I mean, his, to me at least, his legacy feels very relevant to modern concepts such as belonging, such as, our definitions of identity and resistance, and the stories about, outsiders, boundary crossers, people who are defying all the social norms and cultural norms, and their reinterpretations are very relevant to our modern times, to our times, and this challenging of the binaries and all these rigid categories. So I think, if I'm not wrong, in Iran, there is a National Attar Day, which is April 14th. And it is celebrated by, poetry reading festivals and cultural events and conferences. And I think even the government has spent some, assets, or has some investment in reinterpreting Attar, or having, some focus highlighting Attar. Universities and research centers continue to work on Attar. I mean, Seymour has, featured into visual arts, into cultural productions, cinema, even performance also. But in the West, I can give you very recent examples of the Conference of the Birds, Mantiqate, has been translated by Sholeh Volpe and who's an amazing translator. And she also has taken it to the stage. So reading Attar's poetry with performance in Getty Village, actually, Getty Villa in 2022. And then we also have this illustrated translation by Leili Anvar, who's in France, that blends the classical Persian poetry with Islamic art and makes this multi-sensory experience for the readers. And there are scholars like myself and Austin O'Malley in the University of Chicago who have, recently written complete books on Attar. So there's also that kind of scholarly work.
The majority of the research I have been doing regards Persian mystical philosophical poetry. Sheikh Mahmoud Shabastari, Rumi, Shams Tabrizi, Faiz Kashani. What I have understood is that in the West, like in the English language literature, although there are some valuable works, there is this great lack of focused research papers focusing on specific philosophical or mystical topics, instead of giving descriptive accounts, instead of producing literary works, reading the work and just deriving what the figure says about a specific point in the context of the commentaries and the broader tradition, Islamic, Persian, if so comparative with the West. And I'm happy that you're doing such work, and I think we should be fueling this kind of research by inviting scholars towards in-depth analysis.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, without reading the original books, it's not possible, like the text in Persian, it's not possible to have not just about Attar, Rumi, or the medieval or Sufi works, but also like the contemporary works. If you're just basing your analysis on translation, that's just impossible.
Yes, see what happened to Rumi. We see quotations and posts, Instagram posts from Rumi that don't even belong to Rumi. You see Rumi in his books, you see Rumi in social media. There are two different figures.
Circulating on social media, and people are taking it out of the context and thinking about their life and love stories, and it's not even Rumi. But
Professor, the next question, a very important question for me, so I'm really eager to hear your thoughts on this, is this: what role does storytelling and allegory play in conveying metaphysical truth in Attar's works?
I just again, I talked about Sheikh San'an. I talked about, the birds in the Conference of the Birds and Layli and Majnun. All of these, the context of allegory, they are in the context of storytelling, right? Generally speaking, in Sufi language, in mysticism, in Sufi poetry, everything is told in indirect storytelling way. It's just like, because I'm Armenian, like I read the Bible, it's just like the Bible. There's all these small stories and parables that are supposed to teach us a bigger story, which is what you see in Attar's works. All the stories, there is this big framework, which is in Mantiqater, for example, is the story of the birds flying, but the birds are all also on their path, given these small bits and pieces of, parables and stories, which are in the form of allegory. So storytelling, you can say that is very central to Attar's poetry. It's not just decorative or aesthetic. It's essential for, conveying his spiritual message, spiritual insight. And he uses allegory to get to a deeper truth, to that, to show that love that we talked about, and to get us to the knowledge that we want to get to. And we also have, I think it's in Elahiname that we have the king and his sons, for example. And while the bigger framework is that there is a king who's supposed to ultimately will be dying, and he wants to, his sons to be his successors. He's giving them stories and allegorical, parables to teach them life, kind of. So we have the stories of kings. We have stories of a king that in my book I have focused so much on. I have a chapter about is Sultan Mahmud Ghaznavi, Sultan Mahmud of Ghazna, and his slave Malik Ayaz. So we have stories about them, and we have the mad lovers, Layli and Majnun. We have Sheikh of San'an. We have, all these other smaller characters. There's this transgressors who are coming to us, but all these stories are put in allegorical form, indirectly teaching us, that transformation, that's spiritual transformation that is supposed to unfold for us. So yeah, it's a strategy, basically. Allegory and storytelling is a strategy for Attar to bring us that spiritual awakening. And it opens this imaginative space where new truths can coexist. There is not one single truth. There are new truths. There are multiple, and they all can coexist.
Thank you. Yeah, what the audience might find interesting is that the stories related to Sultan Mahmud Ghaznavi and his servant Ayaz also are echoed in other poets' works, like in Rumi's works. And I recently came across this discourse from Shams Tabrizi. I've been studying his discourses for some time. And Shams too narrates a story about these two figures.
I am absolutely, mesmerized by Malik Ayaz, because when I'm talking about like underdogs, is someone like Malik Ayaz. He is the slave, right, of Sultan Mahmud, and then he walks up that ladder, getting all these, ranks and stuff ultimately. But he is the slave, and Sultan Mahmud is the king. And then Malik Ayaz is the one who's teaching the king about spirituality and life and love and all those things that we're talking about. He critiques him. It's amazing. And when I talk about like the underdog who becomes the role model, is someone like, Malik Ayaz. There's one line, I don't remember if it's in Musibat Name or Ilahi Name maybe, that Malik Ayaz says that he is actually the Sultan rather than Sultan Mahmud, because he owns the Sultan's heart. Because Mahmud is in love with Ayaz, so he is the king of his heart.
Professor, would you like to recite some verses from Attar in Farsi?
Sure. This is the book, everyone, and this
Amazing.
is the translation of the book.
Oh, interesting. It's translated into Farsi.
Yeah, in Farsi, so people can actually read it. But in my book, when I don't know if you can see, when I
to some
use,
extent.
you see,
Yes.
I added the Persian.
Oh yeah.
I made sure that I had the Persian added. Let me see. I actually might want to read. I love Wadi ʿIshq. The book starts with Wadi ʿIshq. So let me read Wadi ʿIshq. Okay, so this is from the Mantarate, the Conference of the Birds, and it's the Valley of Love. Since we have been talking about love so much, let's read the Valley of Love. We have the 7 valleys, as you know, in Mantarate. بعد از این وادی عشق آید پدید، غرق آتش شد کسی کانجا رسید. کس در این وادی به جز آتش مباد، وانکه آتش نیست عیشش خوش مباد. عاشق آن باشد که چون آتش بود، گرم رو سوزنده و سرکش بود. عاقبت اندیش نبود یک زمان، در کشد خوش خوش بر آتش صد جهان. The English translation is, love's valley is the next, and here desire will plunge the pilgrim into seas of fire, until his very being is inflamed, and those whom fire rejects turn back ashamed. The lover is a man who flares and burns, whose face is feared, who in frenzy yearns, who knows no prudence, who will gladly send 100 worlds toward their blazing end.
Beautiful, amazing poetry. Thank you very much. You know, one of the things that makes poetry special is that melody and the emotional depth that the verses carry, which we do not usually have in prose. Prose is dry, but poetry like stirs your emotions, making things more acceptable.
Thank you. Yeah, it's poetry is all about getting into the emotions also as you're reading. So, of course, because you know, I teach translation here to my students. I don't get to read the Persian aloud, you know, hearing my own voice.
You did it beautifully.
Few lines from Layli and Majnun. So to me, Layli and Majnun transgress their familial and social kind of boundaries, because their families have these lines that they cross. So each one of the chapters in the book is devoted. The first chapter is about Rabe Adawiye, and then the second chapter is about Sultan Mahmud and Ayaz. The third is about Layli and Majnun. And then the next one is about Sheikh Sanan and the Christian girl. And the conclusion is about so many other different smaller, you know, boundary crossers. So here's some lines from Layli and Majnun. اهل لیلی نیز مجنون را دمی در قبیله ره ندادندی همی داشت چوپانی در آن صحرا نشست پوستی بستد از او مجنون مست سرنگون شد پوست اندر سر فکند خویشتن را کرد همچون گوسفند آن شبان را گفت بهر کردگار در میان گوسفندانم گذار سوی لیلی ران رمه من در میان تا بیابم بوی لیلی یک زمان تا نهان از دوست زیر پوست من بهره گیرم ساعتی از دوست من. So the English is, when Layli's tribe refused Majnun, he found they would not let him near their camping ground. Distraught with love, he met a shepherd there and asked him for a sheepskin he could wear. And then, beneath the skin, began to creep on hands and knees as if he were a sheep. Now lead your flock, he cried, past Layli's tent. It may be I shall catch her lovely scent, and hidden by this matted fleece, receive from untold misery 1 hour's reprieve. So this is again another story of Majnun becoming a sheep humbling himself, breaking his ego, the nafs, to meet for a minute or pass by Layli's tent to just feel the scent of Layli, which is, again, Attar telling us you have to cross all those boundaries of societal boundaries here for Majnun becoming an animal, actually, so that he can meet with the beloved, Layli. And then here's one from Sheikh San'an, which I love. This part from Sheikh San'an is about their first meeting with a Christian girl and how the Sheikh feels. دختر ترسا چو برقع برگرفت بند بند شیخ آتش در گرفت چون نمود از زیر برقع روی خیش بست صد زنارش از یک موی خیش گرچه شیخ آنجا نظر در پیش کرد عشق آن بت رو کار خیش کرد شد به کل از دست و در پای افتاد جای آتش بود و بر جای افتاد. The Christian turned, the dark veil was removed. A flare flashed through the old man's joints he loved. One hair converted hundreds. How could he resist that idol's face shown openly? He did not know himself. In sudden fire, he knelt abjectly as the flames bit higher. In that sad instant, all he had been fled, and passion's smoke obscured his heart and head. Yeah, these are all where you see all those themes of breaking the nafs.
Gorgeous, gorgeous poetry. Thank you very much for that recitation.
Of course.
Last question is, how do you see Attar's voice resonating today, transcending his own culture and religion?
I'll tell you what he has done to me, and how it has resonated with me is because he pushes against dogma. He pushes against fundamentalism, and he embraces love that is boundary breaking, that is inclusive and transformative. So his poetry resists religious formalism, resists orthodoxy, and gives us these questions. There are two questions that I always think when I read Attar. He's asking me, what are you excluding? Who are you excluding? Who's the other? Myself, because the self, the nafs, is how we define ourselves. The other is who's like the exact opposite of the self. Attar is asking us to bring the two together. So when you're reading Attar, you're constantly questioning, this is how I'm defining myself. Who's that other that I'm excluding? That's one question you're asking yourself. The next question is, what norms do we protect at the cost of deep truths? Are they societal norms, religious norms, ethical norms, moral norms, any, like whatever norms there are that we are protecting at the cost of the actual real truth, which is that spiritual Maʿrifat? What are those? We need to cross them. So in a world, the modern world that we are living today, contemporary, it's very polarized with all this, identity politics and exclusion. So if I'm, Iranian Armenian, then I'm Christian, so I have to exclude this and that. And, those people, which is like identity politics, his vision of divine love is very different from identity politics. It is unifying. It brings the polarizing units together, or the polarizing the binaries together. It's blurring those lines. And he's inviting us to rethink our selfhood, our subjectivity, which is the title of my book. What is our self? What is our subjectivity? What is our identity? In modern terms, obviously in Attar's time, it wasn't about these concepts, but in modern terms, this is what his poetry is doing for the readers. And I believe that his language, his spiritual language, his mysticism is also very universal. He's talking about love, he's talking about pain, he's talking about longing, he's talking about religious doubt. We all come to a point that we are doubting our faith. We have this limbo, uncertainty, and then the transformation. So I think it's very human and very universal, and transcends Persian literature, transcends Islam or Islamic art. It speaks to many people in many different ways. And if I were, because in my book, I also put him in conversation with a lot of modern theory. If I were to summarize like what the concepts that we talked, how they resonate with modern theory, I can tell you that this fluidity of identity, selfhood, subjectivity that Attar has in his works is really speaking to post-structuralism, for example. And then his, the process of breaking the self, the nafs, and the entire process is similar to existentialism. Or his bringing together of the self and the other and engaging them together is, again, in conversation with identity politics and intercultural or interreligious dialogue. His use of allegory that resists fixed meanings finds parallels in literary studies and postmodern, for example, criticism. And then, of course, breaking of the ego, the nafs, is just psychoanalysis. So there's, if you think about, parallels in modern world from what we see in Attar or even Rumi and other medieval Sufi poets, you will be able to find some parallels. And this is not artificially making Attar modern, of course. It's just trying to understand that there are concepts that have continuity. They cross the boundaries of space and time. What Attar was discussing in a different tradition, in a different time period and different context, continues to do to today. And that's what makes it universal and very human.
That was too good not to ask any questions. So I'm going to ask one more question, although I promised that the previous one was the last one. The Conference of the Birds, this beautiful work from Attar. In English language literature, do you think there is still reception and research requirement that you would encourage scholars to research this work still? Or you would say, no, there's already enough literature, move on and work on something else?
I think Conference of the Birds has so much to give that you will be able to find things that have yet to be worked on. So there is space for more work for the new generation. And I really believe that, every generation, every scholar has their new perspective, right? They bring in something new to the table. And I believe all these works, not just Conference of the Birds, I will argue that all of Attar's works, even Rumi and the others too, they are, to me, they are living entities. They're not relics. They're not of the past. We are not done with them. We can just keep reinterpreting them with new concepts and new perspectives.
Wonderful. Professor, thank you very much for participating in this interview. I'm honored, and I really, really enjoyed it. And I'm sure the audience will enjoy as well.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed having this conversation with you and with your listeners. Thank you, everyone.
You're welcome, and thank you again for your kind acceptance, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank you, you too. Bye.
Bye.